welcome back to my channel. I am really excited for today's video, like super nerdy that I'm really excited for this video, but I have been looking forward to this video since I got the idea about this whole like project type of thing last like October or November. I got this idea and I figured I wasn't going to do it at the end of last year because it wasn't going to make sense. So I wanted to start it in 2020, but I wanted to do this project, which we're going to get into, quarterly. So I knew I wasn't even going to be making my video until the end of March, beginning of April. So I have literally been looking forward to this for so long, for like 5 months. So I'm very excited for today's video. We are going to be talking about my palette usage of my entire palette collection throughout all of last quarter, so the last 3 months since January, and I am going to be tracking my progress on my palettes every 3 months and sharing what palettes are getting use in my collection, what palettes are collecting dust, and then I have some other stipulations for my usage and stuff too. So I'm really excited to share everything with you. Essentially, I've been tracking every single time I reach for a palette in my collection, whether it be to use that entire palette to create one look or just reach for one shade out of a palette. If I use the palette, I tally it, and I have been tracking that since January. I'm going to be decluttering some things today. We're going to be talking about what's gotten the most use, least use, etc. So if you guys are excited about today's video, like me, then stay tuned. First, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, I hope you'll consider doing so before you go. I do post videos at least 4 days a week, so if that's something that interests you, subscribe before moving on. Other than that, let's just get into the video. All right, you guys, before we get into it today, I want to say, I don't know why I'm like extending my arms, like a huge internet hug. Thank you guys so much for 8K. I truly can't believe it. I remember when I first started consistently posting on YouTube, I was like, wow, I don't even know if I'll ever get like 1,000 subscribers, but it'd be cool if I did. And now we're at 8K, which is just so exciting. So thank you to anyone who subscribes and comments and anything. Your guys' comments have been so sweet lately. I just posted my Pan Those eyeshadows and I got so many recommendations on ways that I could use a shade. And I was like, wow, like my subscribers are awesome. So thank you guys for 8K. Super, super excited about that and wanted to throw that out there before we get into today's video. So like I said in the introduction, we are talking about my palette usage since January of this year. I'm going to track every 3 months. Any palette that I have not reached for in the last 3 months, I'm getting rid of. I'm getting rid of it. I clearly don't care to have it that much if I haven't reached for it in 3 months or more. I started, or the peak of my palette collection this quarter was 83 palettes. That's a ton of palettes. 3 months, if you average it to 90 days, that's pretty much using one palette a day with a few days doubled up. I did mention in the introduction, even if I just reach for one shade in a palette though, I do count it. But 83 palettes is just too much. It means there's palettes in my collection that I love that are not getting used, and that's why I want to be like a little, and that's why if I haven't reached for a palette, I want to get rid of it. There are also some other palettes that I have just decided to declutter. I really tried to think hard about my palette collection and what palettes are sitting around or hanging around in my collection that are stopping me from getting to use a palette that I might love more. So I think I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 palettes to declutter today, which is really exciting. So I want to start with the palettes that I didn't reach for at all, not one time, not for one shade the past 3 months, and those obviously I am just getting rid of. I also decided, sorry, this is like a lot of information. I also decided that at the end of the year, if there is any palette that has not been used a minimum of 10 times throughout the year, I will also just be getting rid of those palettes at that time. All right, those are kind of my rules and stipulations. So let's start with the palettes that I didn't reach for at all. So I have 5 of them. The first is the Huda Beauty Emerald Obsessions palettes. Now you guys know I love the Huda Beauty Obsessions palettes, but specifically the gemstone line was kind of a bust for me. I also owned the amethyst and I ended up giving that to my daughter to play with because I just wasn't a fan of it. This is what this palette looks like. There are some really pretty green shimmers in this palette and I really do love a good green shimmer, but I just never feel interested in reaching for this. I have other green shimmers throughout my palette collection that I like and reach for over this, and I just don't really like working with the mattes in this palette, so I didn't reach for this at all. I am going to be decluttering this. Also, this one from Butter London, this I received in a BoxyCharm. I used to really like the shade Queen from this palette. It's just your standard rose gold shimmer. This is a really boring palette in my opinion, to not be nice about it. Even though I like that Queen shade, I have so many other shimmers in my collection that honestly are better quality than this. I can't reach into this and create a look solely out of this palette. I just personally cannot, and I just don't really like this palette, so I didn't reach for this and I'm getting rid of it. This one from Marc Jacobs. This is the Smartorial palette. This is their blue palette, and while I do really like the quality of Marc Jacobs shadows in general, I just don't ever reach for blue shadows, and I didn't reach for this one at all the last 3 months, so this one I will also be getting rid of. This next palette is a palette that I have decluttered in the past but decided to keep, and it is the Tartelette Toasted palette, and not having used it the last 3 months really puts it into perspective. I don't need to keep this palette in my collection. This is what this palette looks like. This is a fine palette, but I have shades like this throughout my collection that I can use. And this is really one of those palettes that I feel like is one of the palettes that when I use this, it's really keeping me from using a palette in my collection that I like better. Again, I have these shades in my collection. A look that I can create with this palette, I can likely create with a different palette in my collection that I like better. So I will also be getting rid of this guy from Tarte. And then the last palette is a palette that I have been thinking about decluttering for a little bit now, and I almost was purposefully not reaching for it, but I was never sad that I wasn't reaching for it, and I feel like I'm going to upset some people with this one, but it is the original Jaclyn Hill palette, original collaboration. I've been corrected before. I know that Jaclyn did a partnership with Morphe where she like picked her favorite shades, and that was the original Jaclyn Hill palette, but I'm talking about this palette, okay? I'm holding it up right here. Mine's super dirty. I actually got this like the day that it launched for the first time, and Jaclyn Hill used to be one of my favorite YouTubers. Honestly, she's the reason that I was inspired to start a channel, but over time I just don't really care for her as much anymore. This is what this palette looks like. While I like the shades in this palette, I think the quality is fine. Honestly, I can create looks that I can create with this palette with other palettes in my collection. This is a ginormous palette. I don't really care for large palettes like this either, so that's another reason that I don't really reach for this. I really love this middle row right here. But you guys, I made it 3 months without reaching for this and wasn't too sad about it, so I'm going to get rid of this one. Okay, so those were the 5 palettes that I did not reach for at all. Next, I want to get into the other 8 palettes that I have decided to declutter, and I will let you know how many times I used those palettes. So let's start with this one from Dominique Cosmetics. This is the like mini Celestial Thunder that came in BoxyCharm, and I just recently posted my updated palette collection. I will leave that linked for you guys. I said in that video that I was happy to have this palette, and after filming that I was like, you know what, I only had 8 palettes at that time that I wanted to declutter, 3 of the 5 that I hadn't used at all, and then 3 others, and I was like, I need to declutter more of my palette collection because there are palettes that I love that I've only used 2 times the last 3 months, and that's just not the point of having a collection that you love or palettes that you love if you're neglecting them because you have such a large collection. So I was opening up some palettes that I liked, but like felt like maybe I could do without, and this is one of them. I really like these 2 shimmer shades and these 2 warm brown / orange shades, and really, I mean, I have dupes to these throughout my collection. I haven't reached for this palette that often. I only reached for this one time the last 3 months, and this is one that if I didn't like if I didn't have it displayed and didn't see it, I probably would forget even that I own this. So that really tells me that I don't need to keep this palette around, and I can pass this along to someone else who maybe has a smaller collection and can get a lot more use out of it than it's getting in my collection. My nose is so runny, you guys. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and like my foundation has worn away here. But it is what it is today. Next up, this is another one that I just decided to declutter a little bit later. This was one of the like 5 more that I decided to declutter. This is the Natasha Denona Cranberry palette. I reached for this palette 2 times the last 3 months, and really I think what was holding me back from decluttering this, or what's held me back from decluttering this in the past, is the fact that I remember how excited I was for this palette, but this palette just really was kind of a letdown. These 2 matte shades are more of like a satin sort of shade, and I just feel like you have to pair this with other palettes rather than creating a complete look out of this one palette alone. I was really excited for this pink shade, and while I still like it, I just feel like I don't necessarily need to keep this around, even though I don't feel like I necessarily have a dupe for that one. I felt like the 2 times that I reached for this, I was sort of forcing myself to reach for this, and again, that's not the point. So I will be decluttering the Cranberry palette from Natasha Denona. This is one of the palettes that I knew I was going to declutter. This is the Storybook Cosmetics palette. I ended up reaching for this 5 times the last 3 months, but part of that was because I knew I wanted to review this on my channel. And while I do think that they have a very nice formula, I had no issues at all with the formula. In fact, the formula is really nice to work with. It's really just the color story for me that is making me want to declutter this, as well as the fact that it's really bulky packaging. There are some beautiful shades throughout this palette. The blues are really, really pretty, and even some of the mauve tones, but I'm really not reaching for blues that often. I mean, I didn't reach for that Marc Jacobs blue palette at all, and this just doesn't make me feel creatively inspired. I feel like this is a palette that would just sit and collect dust, and I would use it 1 or 2 times just to force myself to use it to keep it around. And again, that's really not the point, so I will be decluttering this one from Storybook Cosmetics. Again, a really nice formula. It's just the color story isn't one that makes me want to keep it in my collection. Okay, and then the other 2 palettes that I knew I was going to declutter are actually 2 palettes that I picked up in January of this year, and it is these 2 from Fenty Beauty. I was so let down by this formula. I used the Smoky Side which is palette number 6, 3 times, and then I used Cadet 4 times, which is number 7. This is what Cadet looks like. It kind of reminds me of Soap Culture. I just don't think the formula on this is very good at all. I feel like they aren't that pigmented. The shimmers just don't have like a very foiled effect. They take a lot of building up, and then they can look a little bit chunky on the eyes, and I just don't feel inspired at all to reach for these 2. So I unfortunately missed by the time I decided like I really did not like these, I had missed the return date, like my chance to return it. So I will just be passing these along or possibly selling them on my Poshmark, but definitely decluttering these from my collection. I've also decided to declutter my Violet Voss Essentials. This is one that was kind of hard for me to decide to declutter it, but I was looking at it, and honestly it just came down to the fact that I feel like the colors in here that I would want to reach for, I have throughout my collection. I don't need to keep this one. I don't need to have this massive palette collection, and still I have a very large palette collection. I don't need to have 80 plus palettes in my collection. Honestly, I would love to see my palette collection get down to like 50 or less, which still I know is a lot, but I don't need to keep this around. This is another one I feel like I would be forcing myself to use, which isn't the point. I'm also going to be getting rid of this one from SPUTE. This I also do really enjoy. I really like this palette. I think it's really nice. But again, the shades in here that I just feel like this is a very dupeable palette. And I did not reach for my Modern Renaissance all that much the last 3 months. Which is why I'm deciding to get rid of this, because this just reminds me of the Modern Renaissance, which I prefer over this. You get more shades in the Modern Renaissance. So even though I think this is a nice palette with a nice formula, I just do not need a million Modern Renaissance dupes in my collection. And then I'm also going to be getting rid of this one from SPUTE. Even though, again, I think that it is a nice palette with a nice formula, I just don't feel all that inspired to reach into this palette. Some of these colors are a little bit more vibrant than I like to go day to day. And usually on days that I'm not going to work, where I'm like playing around, I like to play around with more color, not necessarily just like more vibrant neutrals. So I know that there's someone else, a better home for this than my home, so I will be decluttering this. And then the last palette that I've decided to get rid of is this one from Juvia's Place. This is the Saharan 2, and I just feel kind of meh about this one. I think the formula is nice. I really do like Juvia's Place palettes. I still have 4 in my collection, I believe, but I just feel like I don't feel that creatively inspired by this one either, and I feel like I really do not need this one. This shade right here actually pulls a lot more pink toned than I thought it was going to, and I have warm browns and a warm red in my collection. I mean, I can reach into my Soft Glam, I can reach into my Modern Renaissance, and then the shimmers in here are fine, but I have the Tarte Unleashed palette, which has blues similar to this, and I don't need this one, so I'm going to be getting rid of this one as well. So those are the 13 eyeshadow palettes that I'm going to be getting rid of. So after decluttering those 13 palettes, my palette collection is now down to 67 eyeshadow palettes, which I know is still a lot, but I'm really excited to be under that 70 mark. I would love to not see my palette collection go over 70 again. I do have a weakness for eyeshadow palettes, you guys. I have a weakness for eyeshadow. I just love I'm not a good artist, a good drawer, a good anything really when it comes to creativity. Like, I feel like I have really wild ideas, but when it comes to like drawing and art and stuff, not very good. So eyeshadow is like the one thing where I feel like I really get to like artistically express myself, and even though I'm still working on my blending skills and makeup skills in general, I love doing my eyeshadow because I feel like that's like something where I do truly get to be creative when I want to. So I'm okay with having a larger eyeshadow palette collection, but I would love to see it stay at least below that 70 mark. So this was really fun for me to do this exercise. Now I want to talk to you guys about my like palette usage and which palettes got the most use and which really didn't get used at all. So I tracked in order of so the way I tracked it is anything 3 to 10 I have in a category that had like 3 to 10 uses, then I have 10 to 20, and then I have 20 plus. And then anything else that I don't talk to you guys about today has usage of like only 1 or 2 times. And again, I counted it as a use even if I just reached into the palette for 1 shade. So let's start with my 3 to 5 range. I do have 8 palettes to talk about that I used 3 to 5 times or reached for 3 to 5 times. First I have my Natasha Denona Mini Nude palette. Now I have pulled all of my mini Natasha Denona palettes out, and specifically I'm trying to focus on using at least 1 shade from each palette all week. I'm going to try and do that where I pick like 1 palette a week to really try and focus on, but because the mini palettes are mini, I figured I'd pull all of them. So I did reach for this one 3 times in the last 3 months, which I actually thought I would reach for this one more. I am doing the Pan Those Eyeshadows series though, so I also am like focused on that. It's just such a balance, you know, figuring out how to use all your eyeshadow. Then the Hooda Gemstones palette was going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, and I reached for this guy 3 times. Oh no! Did you guys see that? My blue shimmery shade just fell out. It's probably because I just dropped this. Sad. I actually really liked that blue shimmery shade. Anyway, I used this palette 3 times or reached for this 3 times. This was in my Pan Those Eyeshadow series. So for a palette that was going in the Pan Those Eyeshadow series, not the best. Okay, I dropped my ColourPop palette too, so I'm a little bit nervous to open this guy up. We're clear. Okay, so this is my ColourPop Dream Street palette. I used this palette 4 times the past 3 months, and I have pulled this into my Shop My Stash, so I anticipate that I will be getting some more use out of this one. I also love this palette for the spring summer. Some of my palettes that didn't get as much use are like more seasonally relevant to like the summer, but we'll see if those palettes reach that 10 mark, that 10 usage mark that they need to hit to stay in my collection for the year. Next, I have the ABH and Breezy palette. I reached for this a total of 5 times, and this is something that I will continue to reach for. I think that I've used just about every shade in this palette. I did review this palette and say that I was really, really enjoying this one. Even the pressed glitters, I don't mind too much. I actually think that this is a really fun palette. This isn't something that I was originally going to pick up, but I figured I could use the neutrals in this on days that I was going to work, and then I could have fun with the pops of pinks and blues. So I'm really happy to have this in my collection. I anticipate I will get some more use out of this, like even more than 5 times the next quarter. My Hooda Mercury Retrograde palette I absolutely love, and I reached for this 4 times. This palette I love so much, so only reaching for it 4 times was kind of like hurting me in a sense. That's why I decided that I needed to declutter more than 8 palettes. I was like, okay, my Huda Mercury Retrograde I love, but I only reached that 4 times. It's because I'm reaching for palettes that I don't need to have in my collection. So I reached for this 4 times. This is something I just recently talked about in palettes that I think are going to be great for the springtime. So I personally am pulling this out for the springtime, and I anticipate that I will have a lot more than 4 uses at the next update. The Too Faced Palm Springs Dreams palette I reached for 4 times. I got this palette in December in my BoxyCharm and actually used it quite a bit in December, and then reached for it another 4 times the last quarter. And I do like this palette. It's not my favorite by any means. This is something I was like, should I declutter this? But I also like that you have some cool tones throughout this, and the shimmers in here are really nice as well. So yeah, my Gemini palette I reached 4 or 5 times. This is another one I got in December, so I was using this a lot towards the end of December, and then I used it an additional 5 times since January. I do really, really love this palette. It is a little bit more grungy. This is one that I don't necessarily create work looks with, so if I'm reaching for this palette, it's either on my day off, on my weekend off, and not necessarily to work, which is why I feel like this hasn't gotten as much use. But this is one of my favorite palettes in my collection. I love the artwork. I just love the color story, and this is a really nice one from Melt. The Rust palette is now available at Sephora, and I really, really, really want to get the Rust palette. Who's with me on that? And then the last palette is the ABH Modern Ren palette. I only used this 3 times in the last 3 months, and those 3 times were very recently. I just pulled this into my stash, to my Pan Those Eyeshadows, and I'm working on the shade Vermeer, and I pulled this into my Shop My Stash because I was like, my Modern Renaissance, I have not reached for that at all. I need to reach for this. So that is another reason I was like, okay, I need to get rid of these palettes that have the Modern Renaissance vibe, because I love this palette and I don't want to get rid of it, but my other palettes are taking time away from this. So I used this 3 times. Again, this is going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, so I probably will have a ton of use on this next update, but only reached for Modern Renaissance 3 times. All right, next up we have the 5 to 10 range, and I only have 3 palettes for that. All 3 are in separate projects or in projects. So first we have ColourPop Baby Got Peach. I used this 10 times the last 3 months. This was going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows and still is, which is one of the only reasons I reached for this. I do love this palette, but this is more like a springtime palette to me. So I do anticipate, 1, because it's still going in a project, and 2, because it's getting closer to spring, I will reach for this quite a bit more the next 3 months, but used this one 10 times. My Urban Decay Naked Reloaded, I just rolled into my Pan Those Eyeshadows. I did use this 6 times the last 3 months. This is a really easy one for me to create work appropriate looks with. So I anticipate this will have well over 6 the next update as well. But this one I used 6 times. And then the Nubian Mini by Juvia's Place is going in my Roulette Pan collab. I had used this 2 times until pulling it into that project, and then I used it an additional 8, so we're up to 10 times on the Nubian Mini. I love this palette. This is one of my favorite go-to palettes, similar to the Natasha Denona minis. It's just nice to have a mini compact palette you can reach into. You know exactly what you're gonna do, and it's very nice quality. So I love this one. I'm sure this will have at least 10 uses the next update. So those are my 3 palettes with usage between 5 and 10, and now we are going to move on to 10 plus. All right, to finish it off, I have 11 palettes that I have used 11 or more times. So let's start with the one palette I have used more than 11 times that I will be decluttering, and again, that's the Violet Voss Essentials palette. I just feel like I don't need this in my collection. This was going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, and I was able to pan the shade Cream, which is another reason I was like, should I keep this? Because I've already panned a shade, and even looking at this now, I'm like, a part of me wants to keep this, but I really do not need to keep this in my collection. I did use this palette a total of 27 times, and that's 27 times I could have been using a different palette. You get my drift? The ABH Karlie palette was going in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project. I was able to pan the shade Bare, which is a cream kind of all over lid shade. I used this palette 11 times. After I hit pan on this, I pretty much put this away. So this has not been getting love for me. I do like this palette, and I love some of the more unique like blues and purples up top. But I didn't reach for this. I think because I knew I had reached that 11 mark and was trying then to get use on other palettes. But we'll see where we land next quarter for the usage on this. Let's talk about another palette I used 11 times. This was not going in a project pan, but I did share with you guys in my last Pan Those Eyeshadows update that I did hit pan on this shade right here, La Costa. I was basically unofficially trying to pan this, and I used this palette 11 times. This palette has one of my favorite shades in my entire collection, which is this shade right here. So trust me, I will make sure I use this palette because I will be using that shade. And also La Costa makes just a beautiful, beautiful inner corner highlight. So I really enjoyed using this and used that one 11 times. The next 4 have all been in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, so no surprise they all have higher usage. Starting with my Natasha Denona Mini Star, I do have pan on this shade right here. I used this one 12 times the past 3 months, and I am probably going to unofficially try and pan this shade as well, just because we're getting kind of close on that one. I love the Mini Star palette. The blue brown shade was a dud, but every other shade in this palette I really do love and enjoy using. So I also find this one very easy to create work appropriate looks with. So I used that one 12 times. I'm also up to 12 uses on my Hooda Medium Nude palette. I am currently working on this in my Pan Those Eyeshadows. This is another one I would be reaching for anyway. This is very easy to create work appropriate looks with, and I just love the Hooda Obsessions palette. Sorry, I'm up to 15 uses on this. These 2 palettes I have both used 12 times. First we have the Zoeva Cocoa Blend. I can't remember if I was working on this in my Pan Those Eyeshadows. I don't think I was. I think I hit pan on this and I was planning to pull this into a Pan Those Eyeshadows, and then I didn't. I do plan to probably try and pan this shade as well as this one this year, so I anticipate I will get a lot more use on this throughout the year as well. This one is one of my go-to work appropriate look palettes, so that is why that one I feel like will always get use. And then my Master Palette by Mario. I love this palette. I was working on the shade Marina in Pan Those Eyeshadows, but I did not hit pan on it, or haven't hit pan on it yet. This is a palette that I just could never get myself to declutter. Even when I wasn't using this in my Pan Those Eyeshadows, I reached for this shade quite a bit, which is in the shade Lula, one of my favorite cool tone browns in my collection. I reached for this palette 12 times. I'm sure I will reach for this at least 10 to 15 times again the next 3 months. All right, and now on to the top 5 most used palettes in my collection the last 3 months, starting with my Persona Identity 2. Now, you know I love this palette because this was not in any project at all, and I used this 19 times. This is what this palette looks like. I freaking love this palette. I think it is so nice. I anticipate I will get a ton more use on this as we reach the spring months, because I want to play around with some of the colors in this, and I just love this palette. I would take this traveling with me if I was traveling, but we're not doing that right now. So I used that 19 times. Then my Dose of Colors Baked Browns. This was my 4th most used palette. I used this or reached for this 24 times, and I actually hit pan on 2 shades in this palette this year, and this is another just standard go-to, very easy to create looks. I love the mini palettes, you guys. They are just some of my favorites because I just know exactly what I'm doing, especially if I'm getting ready for work. I wear this palette to work quite a bit, so I used this one 24 times. Already mentioned, but my Violet Voss I reached for 27 times. This was my 3rd most reached for palette, so kind of ironic that I'm getting rid of this, but again, just don't need it. My 2nd most reached for palette this quarter, thank goodness, because this is my most expensive, no, not my most expensive, but a very expensive palette in my collection. This is my McGrath Bronze. I believe Bronze Seduction is the name of this. This was going in my Pan Those eyeshadows. I did decide to finally quit with this. I reached for this a total of 28 times. I was working on this shade right here. Beautiful, just beautiful palette in general. I anticipate, even if this doesn't end up getting rolled into my Pan Those eyeshadows, I will still reach for this a ton. So very excited to see what my usage looks like in the next update. And then my most used, most reached for palette of the first 3 months of 2020 is my Too Faced Sweet Peach palette, which is so funny. This used to be like my ride or die palette the year that this released, which was it 2017? I use this palette all the time, and then I really wasn't reaching for this at all, but I rolled in the shade Charmed, I'm sure, into my Pan Those eyeshadows project, and I reached for this palette a total of 31 times the last 3 months. This is one I've gone back and forth on whether or not I really want to keep, but truly this just has like a special place in my heart, and I love the shade Luscious. Such a good shade, and I'm still working on this. It still smells like peaches, smells really nice. So yeah, ironically, my most reached for palette the first 3 months of the year was the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. I'm really excited to see what, like, when we get to like the last update, like the end of the year, where we're at on like most used palettes. So that was a lot of info. This is gonna be a really long video. I hope that you guys enjoyed. If you didn't, maybe just don't tell me you didn't like it, because I'm so excited about this. I think it's just because I'm so nerdy and like tracking things. But that's where we're at for my quarterly palette usage. Let me know what palettes you've been reaching for the most in 2020. I would love to hear from you guys. Other than that, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye.